Good morning, I'm Karen, and hard act to follow, but I'm going to try to pull it all together and hopefully make this a great learning exchange for all of us. So we've talked a lot about the benchmark and the process and how to continuously improve. I find from my own personal experience, the product comes easy to me. I know what I want it to look like. I have the vision and I have the concepts, but often I forget about the whole process involved and like closing that loop and evaluating it. And so for me personally, that's what accreditation has helped me focus on, is that you do have to continuously evaluate what you're doing. So I have the rest of the standards. Leslie did standard 4, so I'm going to start with standard 1, which is education program and its environment. I'm sure you're familiar with this standard, but the product, you visualize a great school with lots of resources, lots of help, tech support, you have good people teaching, you have a great curriculum. But then there's the process, and so the process to keep improving this. To keep getting better, and being very proactive in your planning and your visioning on what you want things to look like, because we have a changing healthcare environment and we have a changing education environment, so there's lots of dynamics in what's going on, so we always have to keep on top of that, and that's part of what we have to do in order to have a good product, I guess, at the end, good students. Standard 2 is our faculty. So same thing, we need to make sure that we have qualified faculty. And so again, we have maybe experts in areas, but we also need to have experts in teaching. And we need to keep going, how do you keep current and how do you make sure people are qualified and have a caseload that's manageable in order to actually do their job. So it's more than just having a hiring process, but having a dynamic process, having a dynamic interview process and evaluating it and making sure that we are actually getting the faculty to do the job and the professional development involved in keeping them current. And sometimes we always talk about time and numbers, but do we have enough people to actually do the job well? So not just the right people, but enough people, and how do we evaluate that? Standard 3 is the students, and of course we have to involve our students, and we want to make sure that we're assessing and evaluating and providing feedback to our students. Again, we want the product, but we want the process. We want them to be lifelong learners. We want them to develop insight and keep growing and learning as they go along. So we have to teach that as well. So their own continuous quality improvement as you walk out the door. So it doesn't just start at the college and end when you graduate. It's an ongoing thing. And if we mentor that and provide insight into that, and they self-evaluate, then you have a process in place. So again, making sure things are sustainable in the long run. So a lot of planning involved and a lot of executing and evaluating and making sure that this is an ongoing, great learning environment for our students. I don't need to talk about number 4 because Leslie did a great job, so I'm going to jump right to 5. Accountability. We want to make sure that we're accountable and that we are providing consumer choice, right? So transparent about what we're doing. And as therapists, we're always transparent about what we're doing. And so the same thing needs to happen with our public and our students and our stakeholders and everyone involved. So again, you might have some policies and guidelines in place on how to be accountable to your stakeholders, but you need a process to make sure it's going to be a really good, high quality, ongoing way to be accountable and transparent in what you're doing. Again, Brenda and I are at a little plan in Leslie's activity was to look about increasing enrollment of Aboriginal students. And the first thing we thought about is, you can't really ask people to self-identify anymore. So, you have to kind of, keep thinking, okay, well then what do you do? And what does the research tell you to do? And what's the best practice to do this? And then, before you even collect the data, you have to figure out some of these things. So lots of planning involved and continually monitoring that you are actually keep going and accountable. And of course, Standard 6, our favorite and probably near and dear to our heart. This is a product this is what we know. This, we are experts in this. This is what we know. And so we know what we want the product to look like, and we know what we want the health profession to look like. But we need to make sure it's a continuous quality thing. And lots of our colleges have that in place, and accreditation is also another tool that you have, if you choose to voluntarily, to make sure that you're ongoing and you're going to continue to be a really high quality program after you meet the benchmarks as well, right? You have to keep, and it's dynamic, it's changing. So we know these competencies are changing. These aren't static, so they're changing too. So as soon as they change, then we need to also make the adjustments and evaluate it. And I guess 4-year cycle was that before we get really good at this. So 4 accreditation cycles, and how many times will the standards change in 4 accreditation cycles? And they should change, right? We already know they're outdated. So that was my quick little blurb on the rest of the standards. So I'm hoping we covered, the what, the quality assurance, continuous quality assurance, and if we're going to do reflective practice, we have the so what, why is it important, why is it really important to us. So now we're going to do the now what. So I have a little bit of time, I think. You can just get one to.
So everybody gets one of each standard?
Yep. So thank you, Laura. Laura's going to hand out a couple what-if scenarios. And we're going to start with this one here. What if your program accreditation report says that you have a weakness in something? In this case, the curriculum conceptual framework is consistent and current with educational pedagogy. So I always think of accreditation and comprehensive review and key performance indicators and our student surveys and all the things we use to try to make sure we provide high quality programming. That's, to me, our leverage. So if we do a really good job with our planning and our doing and our studying and our executing and reevaluating it, that we should be able to actually use this as a tool to advocate for positive change, right? So I'm hoping people will come up with some really strategies. Maybe you've encountered this in your accreditation, or it's something that you've thought about, some strategies on how you might use the report, accreditation report, to help advocate for continuous quality improvement. So if people in their groups could just maybe take 2 minutes and do the first scenario. Is that okay? Questions about what you need to do or what I'd like you to do? Just kind of evaluating the process as we go along. The first one might be kind of tricky because I'll give you some hints if I can get there. What we're looking for in the conceptual framework, and I didn't list all all the kind of indicators below that, but there's some benchmarks. So first you have to have a conceptual framework, right? So that's kind of your benchmark. You have to have a conceptual framework to start with. And it should be grounded into something that's current and consistent with your vision and mission and your college. So that's the first one. And it has to be consistent with current best practices in education as well. So here's a bit of that continuous process as a hint. So you might have that conceptual framework, but how do you make sure it's going to be a good fit? And how are you going to monitor that, and how to improve it and get it better? Pat and I are from Centennial College, and I think everything educational we go to lately always has a new conceptual model. And so recently we were given one about, what was it, academic excellence or something like that, and you know, this wonderful conceptual model, but it was based on current practices, and it was developed, and it's changing. So there's always something new and different. Like even scholarship of teaching and learning, suddenly there's a conceptual model. and so I think to get you going, you have to have the conceptual model first, but how do you ensure it's going to stay current and it's going to be reflective of what you want? Does that help for the first one? The next one, because it's a core, it would be considered a deficiency, and sometimes the language of deficiency seems punitive to people, but think of that as a leveraging tool. If I tell my chair it's a deficiency because it's a core thing that we find super important, it might more likely actually happen because of the terminology used. People will get that. People will get that if you say, hey, I need this. And so it's not just making sure that you have great staff and a hiring process, but how do you make sure you're going to have sustainable quality of staff, but also a manageable caseload that goes with it. And I think sometimes that's what we struggle with at our colleges. So I don't know if some of you have had a deficiency in one of these, but if you did, you may have actually been able to use it to advocate for more full-time faculty or more staffing. Anyhow, so quick tips on how you might make sure it's a continuous process. So not just when you come in and get your accreditation report, how do you make sure it's going to be dynamic and reflective of ongoing needs, right? Okay, so this time 1 minute, go. Minute to win it. Sorry, no prizes. If people could write down their tips, I'm gonna collect them at the end. And so if people are interested, I'll send out the information after. Okay, I wanted to give 2 minutes for the next one because I think this is one we could all use some leverage, advocacy, and continuous quality improvement. We all know this is difficult, and we all know to sustain this is difficult. And so it's the sustainability that is the key if you're looking at continuous quality improvement. So if you're having difficulty reaching the benchmark, and you know that it's not going to get necessarily easier depending on what's going on in your region. I know in our region, in Greater Toronto area, it's tough to even reach the benchmark sometimes because there isn't pure OTA placements anymore. Everyone, for the most part, is hired as a dual trained OTA and PTA. So you don't have a pure OTA placement anymore where you know you're going to get these hours. And when you come into a combined placement, even if it's even if it's hired as a 50-50%, when the student walks in the door, it's not necessarily that. So this is our tough one, right? So this is the one that we want to invest some time in. How are you going to get support and advocate for transformative change? Okay, so you get 2 minutes for this one, because this one's important. Go. I'm cognizant of time, so I want you to please continue your discussion, but grab some coffee, have a break, and then after the break, if people wouldn't mind handing your tip sheets back to me, that would be great. So I think the washrooms are just down the hallway to your right. Enjoy coffee, have breaks, continue the great discussion.